Thank you very much for the organizers, for the sponsors, for everyone who has made it tonight. I really appreciate the honor. My talk is titled, Decolonizing Our Minds and Nourishing Our Hope. So I'll start with an anecdote about hope. When I went to school here at Columbia, I'm so ashamed now of saying that. No one is perfect. I was an engineering student. I must have been no fancy anthropology or engineering. But I was part of the anti-apartheid movement, the South African anti-apartheid movement, a very tiny little part. And as I held up signs abolish apartheid, my fellow students of engineering would pass by, looking at me as if I've come from Mars. And they would say, what are you doing, wasting your time calling for abolishing apartheid? One of them asked me, do you really think this will happen in your lifetime? And then I said without hesitation, no. But I'm doing it out of a moral obligation to do the right thing. Justice in South Africa is justice for me and justice for everyone. So I'm doing it out of that moral obligation. But it did happen in my lifetime. Apartheid and that gives me eternal hope. And many of you know about the 1948 Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of most of the indigenous Palestinians. Some might not know that the Nakba has never come to an end. Earlier this year, Israeli forces destroyed most of al-Hiran, a Bedouin Palestinian village in the Naqab, in the south of present-day Israel, whose residents are Palestinian citizens of Israel, to establish a Jewish-only settlement on its ruins. Israeli forces gave Palestinian families barely any notice to gather their furniture, photos, books, or children's toys before bulldozing their homes and livelihoods. Far from being an exception, al-Hiran is the norm. Drunk with power and impunity, particularly since Trump's rise to power, as Rebecca so eloquently explained, Israel has embarked on what Palestinians fear might be an escalation of the ongoing Nakba. Israel has dropped its thin mask of democracy, moving at a dizzying speed to build as many settlements as possible in the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel's parliament has not only ignored the recent UN resolution that reiterates the flagrant illegality of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, it just passed a law to retroactively legalize settlements built on confiscated privately owned Palestinian land. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin has warned that this land grab could make Israel, quote, be seen as an apartheid state. That's the Israeli president. This is exactly what a few weeks ago, as Nadine has mentioned, ESQA, a UN agency, concluded. It issued a report co-authored by prominent international expert Professor Richard Folk that concluded exactly that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid against the entire Palestinian population, and that ESQA report called for BDS measures to end Israel's impunity. As Israel tightens its medieval siege of Gaza, its decades-old denial of Palestinian refugee rights, and its brutal apartheid dungeons where thousands of Palestinian political prisoners are being held, and over 1,000 of them are currently on a heroic hunger strike. As Israel adopts more racist laws than ever, cementing what the US State Department once called its institutional, legal, and societal discrimination against its own Palestinian citizens, Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid stands naked for all to see. As Israel becomes more openly associated with the rising far right around the world, not just the Trump administration and open anti-Semitic figures here in the US, but across the world, especially in Europe, the United States and Europe, it's more widely considered to be among what Tony Judd once called the belligerently intolerant, faith-driven ethno-states. As this happens, more people, grassroots movements, and progressive institutions will feel the moral imperative to join the BDS movement for Palestinian rights as the most effective form of solidarity. Richard Spencer, a leader of the alt-right in the US, has even defended the white supremacist movement's racist nationalism as, quote, a sort of white Zionism. This unmistakable allusion to Israel's exclusionary foundations as a state that privileges Jewish settlers over the indigenous Palestinian population and that treats African asylum seekers as, quote, a cancer, further exposes the often obscured contradiction between Zionism and liberal ideals. As this contradiction becomes more visible, support for holding Israel to account is growing among Jewish Americans, especially millennials, and the broader US public. A 2014 poll by J Street, no less, showed that 46% of non-Orthodox Jewish American men under 40 support a full boycott of Israel to end its settlements. This and other polls cited by Rebecca show the growing impact of the Palestinian-led global BDS movement for Palestinian rights. Palestinians drew a lot of inspiration from the growing bonds of mutual solidarity with movements around the world, defending the rights of refugees, immigrants, women, workers, Black Americans, Muslims, Native Americans, the LGBTQI community, and from the fact that the time-honored tactic of boycott has become the non-violent weapon of choice for Americans opposing Trump and some of the businesses he runs. The long path to justice, however, must start with exorcising our fears and inhibitions and embarking on a radical process of decolonizing our minds. For we cannot possibly pursue freedom while our minds remain colonized and therefore cannot even envision what freedom looks like. Colonizing Palestinian minds is as old as the Zionist colonial project in Palestine, and is still today a very present part of Israel's regime's agenda. Killing Palestinian hope by convincing us that our resistance to their oppression is not just futile, but also suicidal, and that we are relative humans who do not deserve the full set of rights that full humans can claim to themselves, has always been an inseparable component of the Zionist system of occupation and apartheid. Hope, after all, can be contagious. Despite decades of dispossession, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid, Palestinians have not given up. We continue to resist injustice and to assert our quest for equal rights to all humans. This is precisely why Israel is desperately trying to suppress the BDS movement, a key component of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance and the most effective form of international solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. BDS, after all, has not only insisted on the UN-stipulated rights of all Palestinians, it has also rekindled Palestinian aspirations for emancipation, justice, and ethical peace through its ability to develop a nonviolent yet effective means to achieve them. Moreover, BDS is re-establishing the inherent relationship that the so-called Oslo peace process has all but buried between the struggle for Palestinian rights and the diverse international struggles for racial, economic, gender, social, and climate justice. Begun in 2005 by the absolute majority of Palestinian society, BDS calls for ending the 1967 occupation, ending institutionalized racial discrimination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the homes and lands from which they were uprooted and dispossessed. These three basic rights correspond to the three main constituencies that make up the Palestinian people. 38% of the Palestinians live in the occupied Gaza and West Bank, including Jerusalem. 12% are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and 50% of the entire Palestinian people are Palestinians in exile, predominantly refugees. Though launched in 2005, the movement is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian nonviolent resistance to settler colonialism. It is inspired and strongly influenced by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and racial discrimination, including Islamophobia and anti-Jewish racism. The movement believes that a person's identity should never diminish or restrict her or his entitlement to rights. BDS therefore targets complicity, not identity. It is an inclusive movement that enjoys growing support among diverse communities, including a growing number of Jewish Israeli BDS supporters. Since hope based on illusions does not bring the oppressed any closer to justice, one must always ask whether the hope that we're nourishing is based on not just morally consistent, but also effective strategies of resistance that can take us there. In this respect, the impact of BDS must be assessed in light of its two closely related strategies: raising awareness worldwide about the UN-stipulated rights of the Palestinian people, and raising the material and psychological cost to Israel's regime of oppression by mobilizing individuals, institutions, civil society, and eventually states to end their practical complicity in maintaining this regime. Recent international public opinion polls, together with Israel's hysterical reaction, indicate that BDS is succeeding on both accounts. Days ago, the municipality of Barcelona announced measures to end complicity in Israel's occupation and settlement. This follows dozens of municipalities across the Spanish state that have recently declared themselves Israeli apartheid-free zones. In September 2015, the large French corporate giant, Veolia, became the first international corporation to end all involvement in Israel's illegal operations, and it was followed by several other companies like Orange and CRH that have exited the Israeli market under intense BDS pressure. Bowing to BDS pressure as well, after suffering what the Financial Times called reputational damage, G4S, the world's largest private security company, a company that's very involved in the private incarceration system in this country that targets mainly young people of color, decided in 2016 to end most of its involvement in Israel's illegal business. G4S has lost contracts across the world in Jordan, Lebanon, Norway, the European Parliament, South Africa, Colombia, among others. Colombia, the country, not Columbia, the university, obviously. Not yet. In the first week of 2016, the 20 billion Pension and Health Benefits Fund of the United Methodist Church declared the 5 largest Israeli banks off limits for investment due to their involvement in the occupation, as did in 2014, the second largest Dutch pension fund, PGGM. Major churches in the US have also divested, like the Presbyterian Church, have divested from companies like Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, and Motorola Solutions because of their involvement in the Israeli occupation. The credit ratings agency Moody's has assessed that if BDS grows further, it will have a significant impact on Israel's economy. This gradually growing economic impact has come after years of BDS successes in the cultural and academic domains. Over 1,000 black activists, artists, scholars, students, and organizations in the US and elsewhere, for instance, have endorsed BDS, as did the Movement for Black Lives. Thousands of cultural figures in the UK, South Africa, Canada, Ireland, and elsewhere have endorsed the cultural boycott of Israel. While many artists have cancelled gigs in Tel Aviv or refused to perform there in the first place, of the 26 Oscar nominees in 2016 who were offered very expensive, all-paid propaganda trips by the Israeli government, none has taken the offer. Six out of 11 National Football League players also invited to an Israeli junket refused to take that junket, and those include Michael Bennett. Academic associations and tens of student governments in the US, including some of the most prestigious universities, as well as in Canada, the UK, and elsewhere, have voted on various BDS measures against Israel's occupation and companies involved in it. But BDS cannot claim full responsibility for Israel's growing academic, cultural, and increasingly economic isolation, for Israel itself deserves a share, big share of that credit. Israel's 2015 election of its most racist government ever, as even John Kerry has, in a way, admitted, has busied itself passing racist laws through the Israeli parliament at an unprecedented rate. Israeli government ministers have adopted unabashed and unmasked far-right racism, while just a few months ago, Israel's chief rabbi for the Sephardic community called for the ethnic cleansing of Gentiles from the land of Israel. Leading Israeli political and military figures have publicly expressed serious concerns about Israel's descent into an abyss. Ehud Barak, arguably the most decorated general in Israel's history, and a former prime minister, of course, warned that Israel has been, quote, infected by the seeds of fascism. Ehud Barak. While the current deputy chief of staff in Israel, Major General Yair Golan, has compared revolting trends in Israeli society to Germany in the 1930s. Having lost many battles for the hearts and minds at the grassroots level, as Rebecca has mentioned, Israel adopted a new top-down strategy in 2014 to replace its previously unsuccessful strategy of fighting the BDS movement through branding and extensive propaganda alone. Evoking memories of McCarthyism, the new strategy employs legal warfare, espionage, intensified propaganda, tarnishing, and threats of targeted civil elimination. An Israeli anti-BDS law now denies entry to those who support BDS or even those who support a boycott of settlements only. In the US, France, and elsewhere, Israel's deeply influential lobbies are working overtime to promote suppression of freedom of speech on Palestinian rights and to criminalize or demonize the BDS movement. The new anti-BDS strategy that Israel has adopted appears to be failing, as some major Israeli and Israel lobby groups have lately admitted. In a major setback for Israel's legal war on BDS, for example, the European Union, the governments of Sweden, Ireland, and Netherlands, as well as leading international human rights organizations such as Amnesty, the International Federation for Human Rights, American Civil Liberties Union, among others, have all defended the right to BDS as a matter of freedom of speech and freedom of association. This gives us hope. To conclude, the great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish once wrote that he wished he could be liberated of Palestine, so he could write poems of love and life and mundane topics. But as long as Palestinian liberation itself remains elusive, Darwish said, he had no choice but to write about Palestine. Inspired by Darwish, I have a similar deep desire to end my BDS activism. Indeed, to see the BDS movement itself come to an end. For this to happen, however, we need to see freedom, justice, and equality first. When, not if, this happens, I'll be exhilarated to redirect my deep passion for human rights to other struggles that I am particularly passionate about, especially the struggle by blacks for racial and economic justice, and the struggle by indigenous communities around the world for reparations. When, not if, we attain our comprehensive rights, I'll be delighted to fulfill my other passions in life, especially philosophy and choreography. But until then, I have no choice but to continue my modest contribution to this most noble struggle for a life that is worth living, as Darwish puts it, and that can only be a life under freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you.
very much, I said. That was wonderful. I have a few questions, and then we're going to open the floor. First, Omar, I just want you to speak a little bit about Palestinians on the ground and what we do in Palestine in terms of BDS, and perhaps a few words about the BDS movement inside of 48 Palestine in Israel. If you could just talk about this a little bit. And Professor Nadasen, I just, when you were talking about the parallels between South Africa and Palestine, I was thinking about how a lot of the time the debates or the discussions happen, and a lot of the time we end up sort of comparing, you know, whether Palestine is worse or South Africa is worse, and then each side kind of ends up undermining the other. And that debate often happens with Zionists on campus who kind of say it's not apartheid because in South Africa, you know, it was worse, and they start sort of like listing things. So I wonder if there's a way out of this to kind of see Palestine on its own as systematic apartheid, obviously imposed by Israel. And secondly, when you talked about resistance strategies in South Africa, I was wondering if you could also talk about what other forms of resistance were prevalent there. Because as we know, there were the hunger strikers and also the guerrilla movement. So if you could just talk about these a bit more. And finally, Rebecca, I mean, frankly, I've been frustrated by US activism. Demonstrations here take place in police-provided spaces, right? And a lot of the time, you know, we end up going on the street and, you know, people chant, whose street? And everybody responds, our street, but in fact, it's a street provided by the police, right, with the permission of the government. So how can we sort of escalate the movement so that it's no longer dependent on what the state permits or does not? Thank you. So if you can answer these questions, and then I'll hand over to you guys.
Responding to your question about BDS among Palestinians, whether in 67 areas or 48 areas, in the 67 areas in Gaza and the West Bank, due to decades of occupation and inhibition of Palestinian development, the Palestinian economy under occupation is still very dependent on Israel. And therefore, a boycott of Israeli products is extremely difficult, especially in Gaza, where people do not have much of a choice under a brutal decade-old siege. In the West Bank, it's a bit better, but not much better. However, BDS is not just about consumer boycotts. Academic and cultural boycotts are very prevalent in the occupied territories, where the absolute majority of academic institutions and cultural institutions observe the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Among Palestinian citizens of Israel, it is even that much more difficult. As in the case in South Africa, where blacks could not boycott the absolute majority of white apartheid products or institutions, obviously, Palestinians in Israel cannot literally boycott almost anything under the regime of apartheid under which they live. But there's a growing BDS movement among Palestinian citizens of Israel that calls on people outside to observe their moral obligation to boycott. Because boycott is a matter of moral choice. If I have a choice between Israeli tomatoes, some of which might have come from settlements, or Spanish tomatoes or Chilean tomatoes, it's a moral choice. I can decide here in the US what to buy. If the only tomatoes I get are those Israeli tomatoes, I don't have much of a choice. So that's, in a nutshell, the difference between a coercive relationship that you have to engage with because you live under conditions of apartheid, and a voluntary relationship where you choose what to buy and whom to relate to and what institution to work with. So in that sense, Palestinians in Israel cannot, and the BDS movement does not call on them to boycott the institutions of the state or most of the products of the state.
So to answer your question, in terms of how to see Palestine on its own, and yes, there are very important differences, and we cannot collapse the two systems. I think, one of the things that struck me when I went there is, and I did actually read and study a lot about South Africa as a scholar, in addition to my personal experiences there, is the South African apartheid system was really based on dependence on black labor. So when you looked at the creation of the homelands, those were created for the purposes of reliance on black workers in the mines of South Africa, the gold mines and the diamond mines. It seems that in Palestine, there was greater sense of a disposability of Palestinian labor, right? There seemed to be less, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think others can speak to it, but the ways in which there was a greater sense of the disposability of Palestinian lives, which was less the case in my experiences in South Africa in the 1980s. I also think it's a very different moment. I mean, the era of the 1980s was when I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, was a time when very few people would stand up and actually try to defend the apartheid system in South Africa. And I'm often baffled now when I see people actually overtly coming out and saying they support the state of Israel. We didn't deal with it in quite that way. So there's a massive pro-Israel lobby that is very powerful that we did not deal with in the anti-apartheid movement. There were people who advocated something called constructive engagement, which suggested that we shouldn't boycott, but in fact we should talk to and deal with white South Africa. And I think it was pretty clear very quickly that that was not a strategy that was going to work. In terms of the various strategies in South Africa, much like the Palestinian movement, the movement evolved over decades. So the ANC was actually formed in 1912. So, it has a very, very long history. And the character of that movement shifted over time. So there was a time when the ANC advocated very peaceful strategies, worked with or tried to work with the white government. It became increasingly clear that those were strategies that were not going to work. So the movement evolved over time. There were student protests, a massive labor movement in South Africa that advocated the end of apartheid. But I just do want to highlight that as much as we revere Nelson Mandela and the ANC now, the ANC had an armed wing. It was a guerrilla struggle, okay? It was not a peaceful movement. And we can look back on that now and talk about how that was a moral struggle. It was a moral struggle achieved with an armed wing and through guerrilla warfare. I think it's very important that we keep that in mind.
First of all, I'm so glad you asked that question. I also actually hate more than anything that one particular chant, the whose streets, our streets, which always happens to happen when we're surrounded by cops. And I think that, this moment is a very interesting moment where we have real opportunities and where all of us are being asked to dig deeper, or many of us are being asked to dig deeper than we ever had before. And so we're in this moment where there's like a real potential for reinvigorating of a much broader and deeper left in this country that hasn't been seen in many, many decades. And at the same time, I really want to honor the emerging movements that have been coming up in the last couple of years, and I think actually, predate this broader resistance, which have been quite vast protests. So I think some of the really inspiring things that have been happening, if you think about Standing Rock and the stand there to physically protect the land of indigenous peoples, and the way that that was led by indigenous peoples, and that brought together environmental rights and indigenous sovereignty, and that brought out veterans, and that brought out women's groups, and that brought out folks from Movement for Black Lives, and it was a really beautiful and like you said, going beyond the state and going beyond what the state permitted in terms of a real movement, and it entailed a lot of sacrifice, and it entailed a lot of difficulty, and I think that's the sort of move that we have to be willing to make in these moments. And I think there's been lots of other moments like that. I think about people putting their bodies on the line to stop deportations from ICE, and I've been thinking about, there's been so many examples from the Movement for Black Lives, Bree Newsom jumping up on the flagpole to rip down the Confederate flag, people locking themselves to the doors of BART so that the whole transportation system in the Bay Area can't work. There's been some pretty exciting examples of going beyond those sort of allowed state forms of protest that I think are the things that we should be all feeling inspired by. And I think, well, my daughter's 14, and she was wanting to go out and protest during the inauguration, and I was very excited by her sort of political awakening. And she was also excited. I know she and all of her friends were putting out on Instagram pictures of themselves at these protests. And so, on the one hand, I was really like impressed and thrilled that she was going out and demonstrating. At the same time, I also wanted her to make sure she knew that this was not just about like the trendiness of protests and about the idea that other people see you on Instagram protesting. And so I told her, like, okay, that's great that you're at the protest. Now every night you're going to go and write a letter, to whoever. And it was a small thing, but I made her do it for like at least 10 days afterwards. So, and I think, I think, she sort of continued to deepen her analysis a little bit. Again, she's 14, but I think it's a thing that Omar was talking about, his talk about no cheap hope. I think the protest thing is a great thing to do if that's what you can do, and then you also have to think of each person needs to figure out what's the thing that they can do to go just a little bit step farther. That's what these times demand. So we don't want to just do a little bit and go home, but we do also, I think, want to take on the opportunities of these moments of people being activated for the first time and think about how we can work with them to push them and encourage them to continue to go further, to do the things that really need to be done in this moment.